Welcome to the Access to Innovators podcast, powered by the premier life skills university, High Point University.
Hello, thank you for joining us. My name is Dr. Daniel Hall. I am Interim Dean of the Erland Phillips School of Business. Today I'm going one-on-one with Mark Sanborn, President of Sanborn Associates and High Point University's Leadership Expert in Residence. Mark, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Oh, my pleasure.
You know, Mark, your bestseller is called The Fred Factor. Who exactly is Fred?
Fred is a real person. I don't write business fables or parables. I met Fred when he delivered my mail. His full name is Fred Shea. He worked for the United States Postal Service in Denver for many years. And when I moved into a new house many years ago, he introduced himself to me, and that's how I got to know him initially. And in short, he was extraordinary in that he had a very simple job, and yet he did it with such artistry and mastery that I was able to kind of find the lessons that would apply to any job or any business or any organization. So I wrote the book, The Fred Factor. Fred is now retired. The book came out in 2004, and I'm still in touch with Fred and his wife, Kathy. My wife, Darla, and I are friends with them, and he's doing great in retirement. But if you've read the book, he is everything and more that I write about, both in The Fred Factor and in the sequel, which was called Fred 2.0.
Oh, yes, great book. So Fred, I mean, he's a postal guy, you know, or a retired postal guy. He sounds like an ordinary guy by all metrics. You know, at High Point University, we encourage our students to choose to be extraordinary. Is there anything wrong with choosing to be ordinary?
Well, the good news is you can choose to be anything you want. It's the United States. We have freedom of choice. People sometimes will ask me, can you make someone be a Fred? And I would always respond, hey, when my boys lived at home, I couldn't make them take out the garbage. So don't ask me about making people do things.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with choosing to be ordinary, but I would suggest that most people that we think are ordinary, and we all have the same number of hours and minutes in the day. Mm-hmm. At some level, we're all ordinary people. Nobody is born extraordinary. You might be born into extraordinary circumstances, but you're born an ordinary baby, an ordinary man or woman. But we get to choose what areas of our life to be extraordinary in. And sometimes the extraordinary isn't visible. It's not the kind of extraordinary that you see in a politician who's running for office or a CEO who leads a successful company. But maybe it's the contributions they make every Wednesday night at the Vacation Bible School when that happens at their church, or maybe it's the fundraising they do to benefit the homeless. In other words, there are different ways to be extraordinary, but I think at High Point, and one of the reasons that I resonate with the whole philosophy here is that I say in my book, nobody can prevent you from choosing to be extraordinary. Mm. It's a choice. It's not a circumstance. And some of the most extraordinary people I know have overcome very bad obstacles. And I don't, have the research to prove it, but my gut tells me more people probably become extraordinary in spite of than because of. In spite of a lack of support, in spite of an education, in spite of wealth, in spite of being born into a good family. Because I just know too many people who say, you know what, I don't have to live this way. My life doesn't have to be this way. And they choose to be extraordinary by refusing to accept the ordinariness of their circumstances or their individual lives.
Yeah, our own president, Dr. Nito Cobain, came over from Lebanon with $50 in his pocket and little to no English speaking skills. And he chose to be extraordinary, and here we are.
Yeah, and I've known Dr. Cobain for many years, and I know he often shares that his mother's advice served him so well that if you would be extraordinary, if you would be great, walk hand in hand with other people who are great. Mm-hmm. And that's why I think, having a campus like High Point University, there are critics who say, the luxury and the accommodations and the buildings and the architecture and the grounds, it's over the top. And yet, to me, you got to set a standard, not just in an academic arena, but you need to set a standard in terms of your facilities, your physical plant, your educators, your administrators. And too often we compartmentalize, and I think one of the reasons HPU is one of the fastest growing and often recognized as the most innovative university is because you apply extraordinary to everything, not just a few things.
Yeah.
And I think that, somebody once, when my brother graduated from high school, I said, the only advice I'm going to give you is whatever you choose to do it better than anybody else. And he's been a successful business person. But I got that idea from reading about a famous Michelin chef who said, if you're going to make French fries, just make the best French fries that anybody's ever eaten. You don't have to be a French cuisine specialist. You don't have to necessarily do something off the charts. But whatever you do it better than anybody else who's done it. And that's an inevitable outcome of success.
That's great. That's great. I've been at High Point University since 2010, and from the most simple experience, the little things, to the big things, I always get this sense of flourishing, and I felt like I flourished at High Point University because I was there. I think I would have a different path if I got a job at any other institution. So, you're an economist.
Not a very good one. Not a practicing economist.
And I'm an economist. So you got your bachelor's degree in economics, and I think it was agricultural economics, right?
It was a very specific, although oftentimes I'm looked down upon because I am an agricultural economist, not, as one of my professors said at Ohio State, a real economist.
Oh, no. Well, I know that you know enough about benefits and costs. So we talked about who Fred is and how he's extraordinary and chose to be extraordinary. And I've heard earlier about he's done this in spite of his circumstances because he didn't have very intentional parents at the time. But what are the benefits and costs of choosing to be a Fred?
I love economics because ultimately it is the study of the allocation of scarce resources that have alternative deployment or alternative options. So ultimately, the greatest resources we have are our time and then the expertise that we develop in our lives. And if you are a leader, then the time and expertise of the people that you lead. The benefits are pretty obvious, but I think sometimes the costs are overlooked, and that is the ability to study a little bit longer and work a little bit harder and to be a true student of your craft, whether that's economics or delivering the mail. I think too many people are on autopilot. They've learned enough to be successful and no more. Or they've learned enough to get by and no more, or they've learned enough to be ordinary or no more. And again, as we just discussed, that's their option. This isn't some kind of an obligation, it's not an obligation. What it is an opportunity. And I try to always frame my life, no matter what happens, is where's the opportunity. Sometimes it's obvious, and sometimes you got to dig pretty deep to find out what it is. And sometimes you live by faith because you don't know how that is going to eventually play out for your good. But I think it all comes back to how you allocate your time and your expertise, and if you are part of a team, that time and expertise of other people. I wrote a book some time ago with kind of a loose construct that said, there's basically only 3 or 4 ways to organize your life, and one is around results. Those are people that get their biggest pleasure over what they accomplish. The second is around rewards. Those are the people that like to produce results, but if you don't reward me for it, then I'm not interested in producing the results.
Yeah.
Then there's recreation, the person that says, you know what, I'm going to bust my hump all week long so I can take the boat out on the lake all weekend. And again, nothing wrong with that. It's just a preference.
Yeah.
But the fourth one is relationships.
Yes.
And I say that if you produce results, you may end up with very few deep relationships. And if you go for only rewards, you may alienate people through your pursuit of status. And if you don't have relationships, you got nobody to go out on your boat with. And that if you focus on the relationships, then you can accomplish and benefit the other 3 areas as well. We get more results when we have a team. Our rewards are better when they're shared. I think the only thing better than getting a reward is helping someone else get a reward. And recreation is more fun when you have people to recreate with. And then, of course, relationships, to me, in my observation, are what drive most successful people in those other areas.
Oh. Well, let's talk a little bit more about relationships. When it comes to leadership and thought leaders talking about this, you hear a lot of the buzzwords about servant leadership and being intentional. What are your thoughts about all that?
First, I have bit of a pet peeve about thought leadership. Thought leadership is bestowed or confirmed. It's not claimed. And today you only have to go to your favorite social media site to see that every third person is a thought leader, even though they're the only person that thinks it. I think that the real confirmation of thought leadership is when somebody says, your ideas, your work have taken me to a place I couldn't have gone without them, or they're new, or they're innovative. And I think we kind of play fast and loose with the term thought leadership. But servant leadership, of course, Robert Greenleaf was at AT&T in the 60s, and I am not a business historian by education, but I like to understand history because it helps us understand the present. And back then, it was about organizational hierarchy and org charts and climbing to the top. And what Robert Greenleaf did is he came up with this really radical idea that Jesus talked about in the Bible, and that is the greatest among you will be the servant. And not servile. I think today we confuse servant and servile. The person who checks you out at the grocery store is providing good service, but they're not your servant. Because servile says you are required to provide me a product or a service or attention or time, and people bristle against that. But I think servant leadership is redundant because all leadership, even though it might not have been practiced that way, is about benefiting the greater good. And leaders are evaluated not on their ability to produce results, but to help other people produce results and to help other people. And I call this the test of leadership. It's a single question. Who or what is better because of you? And if nobody's better or nothing's better, you may call yourself a leader, but just because a mouse lives in a cookie jar doesn't make it a cookie. So you have to look at what is better because of me. And that's what servant leadership is. And it's kind of come back in vogue. It disappeared for a while, but like most things, there's a bit of a trend associated with it. In my work, not trying to add unnecessary adjectives, I talk about intentional leadership. Because for many years, I was asked, what's the one thing all successful people have in common? Or a variation of that question, which is, what's the one thing that all successful leaders have in common? And for probably 30 years, I'd say, I don't know. I haven't figured that out because I know some leaders that do it all right, but get it all wrong. And I know some leaders that do some things wrong, but get it right. I didn't have any sense of a singular thing. But it kind of became apparent to me over time that it was less a trait than it was a behavior that all good leaders have in common. And I call it intentionality. Nobody gets to the top of Mount Everest accidentally. You're never out walking the dog and you make a left-hand turn instead of a right-hand turn and boom, you're on top of the tallest mountain in the world. That does not happen.
Yeah.
It takes months and months of training and planning and provisioning. Lots go into that. Nobody ever gets to the top of their profession without being intentional. Now, there are one-trick ponies. There are bands that had a hit, but those bands disappeared. I call it sustained success. And an intentional leader does two things. Number one, they're crystal clear on what it is he or she wants to achieve or what they want their organization to achieve. There's total clarity. They're not switching direction every time they read a new business book or hear a new speaker. The second thing is that they take the right action every day to achieve it, and I add the phrase, in the world it is. The world it is today in 2022 is different than the world it was before COVID in 2020. And if you're playing by the exact same playbook in 2022 that you did in 2020, you're going to have very limited success. So intentionality is about clarity and consistent action every day. If you have neither, you're really not a leader. If you take action but you don't have clarity, it's what I call wheel spinning leadership. Much energy and drama about nothing. If you have clarity but no action, that's wishful leadership. But intentional leaders have both clarity and they're able to get their team to take the right actions every day to achieve what it is they're trying to achieve.
It's so nice that you talked about clarity and consistency because one of the engagements that you'll have with High Point University students, particularly MBA students, is through our virtual platform that we're doing. And so we'll have you as our leadership expert in virtual residence, and also we'll have David Horsager, our trust expert in virtual residence. And you just mentioned two of his.
I don't trust that guy. Oh, David is a dear friend, so that was a gratuitous and hopefully slightly humorous comment.
Well, but you're talking about what's needed for leadership, and those are two of the C's that is in his 8 C's for trust: clarity and consistency, and so that's, it's great to see all these connections. And what's great about High Point University is they don't get to meet just you, which is great, but they also get to meet lots of innovators and residents, and so that's why it's truly an inspiring environment, and then with caring people at the same time there. And the thing you mentioned earlier about how there's this image of luxury at High Point University, well, that's part of the inspiring environment, to raise the bar, to help people to expect more of themselves. And I think that is a key trait of leadership, to get them to expect more of themselves. And
by the way, I think one of the trademarks of a good leader is they help people see in themselves things they didn't know existed. Mm-hmm. When I think back to the leaders that most impacted me, they brought to my attention an ability I didn't know I had. Mm-hmm. They could spot it as kind of an independent third party, but I didn't recognize it, and they helped me recognize and develop that ability, that skill.
Well, just a quick throwback to servant leadership. What I liked about that movement was that it started to distinguish between managers and leaders. And in your Premier Life Skills Seminar Series talk this morning, you had a great explanation of the difference between managers and leaders. Could you share that with our audience here?
Sure. Well, you can identify a manager from an org chart because managers have power over people. However, you can't necessarily recognize a leader from an org chart because leaders have power with people. Mm. I've met janitors that had more influence on the way a school ran than the principal. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you'll meet a principal who is indeed an effective leader, but it isn't because of their position on the org chart. Leadership is a skill set. And if you work for an enlightened organization or a rational organization, I always say that the title should confirm leadership, but as I said earlier when I talked about thought leadership, it doesn't bestow it. Mm-hmm. John Gardner famously said, we've all worked for a leader that couldn't lead a group of 7-year-olds to an ice cream truck. And I always love that. Maybe it's a little antiquated because there probably aren't many ice cream trucks left, but it isn't about making people do anything. And that's why I think David's work, Horsager's work, is so important, is people follow you because they trust you. If they have to follow you, that's called compliance. Mm-hmm. And nobody that I know talks about compliance like it's a big benefit. Oh, man, I love complying. I love meeting compliance issues. But when people follow you because they want to, that's commitment. Yeah. And commitment's the test of leadership. Another way I look at it in my work is I say, if you had no title, if you couldn't reward or punish people, you couldn't pay them, would they still do what needed to be done? That's the ultimate test of leadership, which is why I love nonprofits and paraministries, because those are organizations that really have to tap into the greater purpose that people have, because they're sure not in it for the big bucks or the mm-hmm. accolades or the recognition. And that's really what good leadership is about.
So glad you mentioned that. I'm a member of the Civita International Service Club, and actually one of my research projects is to see if being members of service clubs naturally promotes the style of servant leadership, and should businesses reinvest in these types of organizations?
Yeah, it's interesting. Is it a self-selecting filter? Do people join organizations like that because of their predisposition to service? Mm-hmm. Or do being in those organizations make them better at serving? To me, the real question is, are people able to be of greater service, regardless of their predisposition, because of the resources and the mm-hmm. encouragement that comes from being in a civic group or organization?
Yeah. So a lot of our students, they have a lot of energy, and this said a lot about millennials, although they're all Gen Z now. So is that millennials, they want to get promoted today. And so how do our students seek leadership opportunities without appearing overly ambitious?
I have nothing against ambition. I think ambition is good as long as it's legal and moral. Mm-hmm. But I always say don't confuse it with leadership, because an act of ambition benefits you. An act of leadership should benefit a greater good. Mm-hmm. I have always been a big advocate that the single best way to become a good leader or good at organizational dynamics is volunteering a lot. When I was in college, I know that was, back when dinosaurs roamed the earth, but I found that there was a tendency to want to get involved in organizations so they, you as a student, me as a student, could list that on my resume or my accomplishment sheet so that I'd be, more desirable to a future employer. Now, regrettably, I think I was, and this is a true confession, I think like a lot of people, I was involved in a lot of organizations I truly didn't impact or lead. And having recognized that, I think the bigger challenge is where can you be of service and where can you learn to lead at the same time? I think ambition that gets competitive is probably the beginning of unhealthy ambition. If it's about beating someone rather than becoming a better person, you might want to look at your motivations. I would also say that it's very possible to be over-involved in volunteer organizations. Elbert Hubbard famously said, if you want it done, ask a busy person. Well, Elbert Hubbard lived 100 years ago. I don't think that's true anymore. I think we burn people out by knowing that they're good at what they do, and we just add to their burden or to their load or to their agenda. So I think right now it's not just about being involved and making a difference, but doing it in such a way that you don't, become self-sacrificial and burn yourself out and flunk your classes to do it.
Yeah, so it's about making a sustainable difference, about being focused in that
and
difference.
Enjoying it. I love successful people who are happy. I know a lot of successful people that aren't happy.
Yeah.
I don't want to be, I can be unhappy and unsuccessful. That's easy. But to be successful and to be happy is a skill set that more people, I think, need.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Mark, it's been such a pleasure talking with you. Thank you for sharing your extraordinary advice and achievements with us today. We are so grateful for your commitment to mentoring High Point University students and joining a remarkable, innovative program that inspires our students and campus community. Thank you all for joining me on the Access to Innovators podcast, powered by High Point University.